The ballroom at Mar-a-Lago shimmered with golden chandeliers casting a soft glow over the gathered guests. It was the evening of March 20th, 2025, a night that held special significance for the Trump family. The vast estate, known for its elegance and grandeur, had been transformed into a breathtaking venue to celebrate a milestone, Barron Trump's 19th birthday. Guests from across the country, including political dignitaries, Hollywood celebrities, and close family friends, filled the room. The air buzzed with excitement as the towering cake, a five-tiered masterpiece adorned with golden accents and the number 19 glistening on top, stood proudly at the center of the hall. Soft jazz music played in the background, blending perfectly with the chatter and laughter. At the head of the room sat Donald Trump, the current president of the United States, alongside Melania Trump, whose usual poise seemed touched by a tender anticipation. Dressed in a sleek, ivory gown, she exuded elegance as her eyes constantly sought her son, Barron Trump. At 6 feet 8 inches, Barron stood tall and charismatic, a striking blend of his parents' best features. Yet, beneath his public persona lay a young man navigating the weight of his family legacy while trying to carve out his own identity. As the evening progressed, Donald Trump took to the stage. The room quieted as he began to speak, his signature charisma filling the air. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, flashing a smile, "tonight, we celebrate a very special young man, my son, Barron. Believe me, folks, he's tall, he's smart, some say he's too smart, and he's got a heart even bigger than I do." The crowd chuckled at the familiar Trump humor, but there was a warmth in his tone that revealed a father's pride. Barron smiled faintly, shifting in his seat, his hands clasped together. Despite the public eye always being on him, he had grown into a quiet, thoughtful individual, someone who preferred introspection over spectacle. His mother's influence was evident in the grace and dignity he carried himself with, even in the glare of constant attention. As the applause faded, Donald's voice softened. "But tonight," he said, glancing toward Melania, "I know someone else wants to share a few words. And if there's anyone who's been by Barron's side from day one, it's his incredible mother, Melania." A hush fell over the room as Melania Trump stood up. There was something different in her expression, an unguarded softness, a glimmer of deep emotion that rarely surfaced in public appearances. She walked toward the podium with deliberate grace, pausing to meet her son's eyes. Taking a breath, Melania began, her Slovenian accent still carrying the warmth of her heritage. "Thank you, Donald," she said softly, "and thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate our son." She looked out over the sea of faces, but her focus quickly returned to Barron. "For many of you," Melania continued, her voice clear yet filled with tenderness, "you see Barron as the young man standing here today. But to me, he will always be the little boy with curious eyes and a heart full of dreams. Tonight, I want to share not only my pride, but also the journey that has made him who he is." Her words, simple yet profound, hung in the air, touching an emotional chord. The guests leaned forward, sensing that this was not just a speech. It was a mother's heart laid bare. She paused briefly, her hand resting delicately on the edge of the podium. "When Barron was born," Melania said, her voice softening, "I knew my life had changed forever. I remember holding him for the first time. So small, so innocent. From that moment, my greatest wish was to protect him. Not just from the world's eyes, but from the burden of expectations." A murmur of understanding swept through the crowd. Everyone knew the scrutiny that came with being a Trump, but few had seen this side of Melania, the mother who had quietly shouldered the weight of raising her son in the relentless spotlight. Looking back at Barron, her eyes glistened. "I have watched you grow, Barron," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "into a man of kindness and integrity. Even when the world spoke without knowing you, you remained strong. And every day you make me proud, not because of what people see, but because of who you are when no one is looking." A wave of emotion washed over the room. Some guests discreetly wiped away tears, moved by the sincerity in her words. Even Donald, usually composed, seemed to shift with unspoken emotion as he watched his wife speak. Barron's expression softened, and for a moment, the polished facade faded. He was no longer the president's son, no longer the public figure, but simply a young man hearing his mother's love echo through the room. Melania took a breath, steadying herself. "As you turn 19, she continued, "I want you to know that your path is your own. You are not just a Trump, you are Barron. And no matter where life takes you, I will always be by your side, believing in you. The room, filled with power and prestige, had never felt more intimate. Melania Trump, often viewed through the lens of her public role, had revealed something far more universal: a mother's unconditional love. As her speech neared its end, she turned fully toward her son. "Happy birthday, Barron," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I love you, more than words will ever say." A wave of applause erupted, but it was more than that. It was an acknowledgement of a moment that transcended politics and public image. And as Melania stepped away from the podium, there was no doubt. This speech had touched everyone's heart. As the applause slowly faded, Melania returned to her seat beside Donald Trump, her eyes never leaving Barron. For a moment, the grand ballroom at Mar-a-Lago seemed smaller, cozier, even with the towering floral arrangements and glittering crystal chandeliers. Guests exchanged glances, touched by the vulnerability Melania had shared. But the evening wasn't over. There was still more to be said, more of Barron's journey to honor. Barron, typically reserved, shifted slightly in his seat. Those who knew him well could tell his mother's words had moved him. A faint smile played at his lips, but there was a glimmer of emotion in his eyes that he couldn't quite hide. For all the public attention he had endured, it was moments like this, private and precious, that meant the most. Melania's speech had struck a chord, but she wasn't finished. Rising again, this time with a more personal touch, she held a small stack of note cards in her hand. "There are a few memories," she began, her voice softer but steady, "that I want to share with all of you. Moments that reveal who Barron really is, beyond the headlines, beyond the name." The crowd fell into a reverent hush as Melania's gaze swept across the room. Her tone shifted, warm and nostalgic, as she recounted the early days of motherhood. "When Barron was 4, she said, her smile growing, he asked me a question I will never forget. He came to me with his favorite stuffed tiger, one he called Stripes, and he said, 'Mama, do you think Stripes dreams when he sleeps?'" She laughed softly, the sound echoing through the room like a warm embrace. The audience chuckled, charmed by the innocence of the memory. "I remember kneeling beside him and saying, 'Maybe he does. What do you think he dreams about?' And Barron, he looked at me with those wide eyes and said, 'I think he dreams about being loved.'" A ripple of warmth spread through the crowd. For all the media attention surrounding the Trump family, few had glimpsed these tender moments, a young boy, innocent and full of wonder, growing up in the shadow of the world's spotlight. As he grew older, Melania continued, "I saw that same kindness and curiosity in everything he did. While others saw a Trump, I saw a boy who spent hours building models of airplanes and reading history books. He wasn't looking for attention. He was simply being himself." Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke of Barron's teenage years, a time marked by both privilege and pressure. "When Donald became president," she said carefully, "life changed overnight. The White House became her home, but for Barron it was a different kind of childhood. Cameras followed his every move. Opinions were formed without knowing his heart." She paused, collecting herself. But through it all, Barron never lost his kindness. He never lost his heart. A few guests dabbed at their eyes, moved by the raw honesty of her words. Even Donald Trump, usually the center of attention, remained quiet, his hand resting on Melania's gently as she spoke. Melania smiled softly, her eyes glistening. "One day when he was 15, she continued, he came home from school and asked me if he could help with a charity project. He wanted to support children who didn't have access to education, children who would never know the opportunities he had. That was the heart of my son, always thinking of others even when the world was thinking about him." The room swelled with emotion. To those gathered, politicians, celebrities, and family alike, it became clear that Barron Trump was more than a public figure. He was a young man with a profound sense of compassion and humility. Melania shifted slightly, her tone lightening. "And of course," she said with a playful glint in her eye, "he is still a teenager. He has his moments, like the time he decided to bake cookies for the entire Secret Service team and ended up setting off the fire alarm in the White House kitchen." Laughter rippled through the room, and even Barron shook his head with an embarrassed smile, his face flushing slightly. It was a reminder that, for all the formality, he was still just a young man figuring out life one step at a time. But through all the laughter, the challenges, and the victories, Melania said, her voice softening again, "What I cherish most is his heart. Barron, you are strong. You are kind. And no matter where life takes you, never forget that you are loved, not just by your father and me, but by everyone who knows the real you." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. It wasn't the silence of discomfort, but of hearts too full for words. Then, in an uncharacteristically spontaneous moment, Donald Trump stood up and crossed the room to where Barron was seated. He placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder, his voice loud but unexpectedly tender. "You know, kid," he said, his signature bravado softened by genuine emotion, "I don't always say it, but your mother is right. You make us proud every single day." Barron looked up at his father, something unspoken passing between them. Despite the public image, despite the headlines, this was real, a father's pride, a mother's love, and a son on the brink of becoming his own man. As Melania stepped away from the podium, the applause swelled, louder and longer this time. It wasn't just for the speech. It was for the story of a young man who had grown up in the brightest spotlight and had emerged not only intact but full of heart. And as Barron stood, towering over both his parents as he embraced his mother, it became clear to everyone in the room. This was more than a birthday. This was a celebration of a life just beginning. A few guests dabbed at their eyes, moved by the raw honesty of her words. Even Donald Trump, usually the center of attention, remained quiet, his hand resting on Melania's gently as she spoke. Melania smiled softly, her eyes glistening. "One day when he was 15, she continued, he came home from school and asked me if he could help with a charity project. He wanted to support children who didn't have access to education, children who would never know the opportunities he had. That was the heart of my son, always thinking of others even when the world was thinking about him." The room swelled with emotion. To those gathered, politicians, celebrities, and family alike, it became clear that Barron Trump was more than a public figure. He was a young man with a profound sense of compassion and humility. Melania shifted slightly, her tone lightening. "And of course," she said with a playful glint in her eye, "he is still a teenager. He has his moments, like the time he decided to bake cookies for the entire Secret Service team and ended up setting off the fire alarm in the White House kitchen." Laughter rippled through the room, and even Barron shook his head with an embarrassed smile, his face flushing slightly. It was a reminder that, for all the formality, he was still just a young man figuring out life one step at a time. But through all the laughter, the challenges, and the victories, Melania said, her voice softening again, "What I cherish most is his heart. Barron, you are strong. You are kind. And no matter where life takes you, never forget that you are loved, not just by your father and me, but by everyone who knows the real you." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. It wasn't the silence of discomfort, but of hearts too full for words. Then, in an uncharacteristically spontaneous moment, Donald Trump stood up and crossed the room to where Barron was seated. He placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder, his voice loud but unexpectedly tender. "You know, kid," he said, his signature bravado softened by genuine emotion, "I don't always say it, but your mother is right. You make us proud every single day." Barron looked up at his father, something unspoken passing between them. Despite the public image, despite the headlines, this was real, a father's pride, a mother's love, and a son on the brink of becoming his own man. As Melania stepped away from the podium, the applause swelled, louder and longer this time. It wasn't just for the speech. It was for the story of a young man who had grown up in the brightest spotlight and had emerged not only intact but full of heart. And as Barron stood, towering over both his parents as he embraced his mother, it became clear to everyone in the room. This was more than a birthday. This was a celebration of a life just beginning. As the applause swelled and filled the grand ballroom, Barron Trump rose slowly from his seat. At 6 feet 8 inches, he was an imposing figure, but as he stood beneath the golden glow of the chandeliers, there was a quiet humility in the way he carried himself. His usual reserved nature seemed to soften under the warmth of his mother's words, and for a moment, the weight of his family name felt lighter. A microphone had been placed on the podium, but instead of walking directly to it, Barron turned first to his mother. Without hesitation, he wrapped her in a hug, tight, genuine, and filled with the kind of unspoken love that only a mother and son can share. The crowd, touched by the raw emotion of the moment, broke into another wave of applause. Even Donald Trump, known for his larger-than-life personality, watched the embrace with an expression that was equal parts pride and sentiment. After a brief pause, Barron made his way to the microphone. He adjusted it carefully, his long fingers steady as he glanced out over the sea of faces. This was not his comfort zone. Unlike his father, public speaking had never been his favorite arena. But tonight was different. Tonight was personal. "Thank you," Barron began, his deep voice resonating through the room. He hesitated for a moment as though gathering his thoughts. "And thank you, Mom." His eyes softened as he looked back toward Melania. "For everything." A hush fell over the crowd. There was something captivating about hearing from Barron Trump, a young man who had grown up under the scrutiny of the world yet had rarely spoken publicly about his own experiences. "I'm not sure how to follow a speech like that," he said with a shy smile, his usual composure showing a hint of nervousness. "I didn't prepare anything quite as eloquent, but I do want to say a few things. The audience leaned in, sensing the weight of his words. This wasn't just another birthday toast. It was a rare glimpse into the heart of a young man who had spent much of his life in the shadow of one of the world's most famous families. When you grow up in the spotlight, Barron began slowly, a lot of people think they know who you are. They see the photos, they read the headlines, but they don't always see the real you. He paused, scanning the crowd thoughtfully. And for a long time, I didn't know if I wanted them to. There was a stirring vulnerability in his words, honest and unguarded. For many in the room, it was the first time they had heard Barron speak so openly. I've been lucky, he continued. I've had opportunities that most people my age could only dream of. I've lived in places that are more like museums than homes. I've shaken hands with world leaders and stood on some of the biggest stages in the world. But at the end of the day, none of that is who I really am. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint clink of champagne glasses being set down. I'm a guy who still plays video games with my friends late into the night, Barron said with a grin, drawing a ripple of laughter from the crowd. I love basketball though, thanks to my height, most people assume I should be better at it. Another wave of soft laughter passed through the room, lightening the mood. His expression turned serious again. But more than anything, I'm someone who's been shaped by the people around me, especially my mom and dad. His words hung heavy with sincerity as he turned toward his parents. Dad, you always told me to aim high, to be strong, and to never back down from a challenge. And I'll admit, sometimes I didn't always understand why you pushed me so hard. But now, standing here tonight, I get it. You wanted me to be ready for anything. And I am. So, thank you. Donald Trump, known for his fiery speeches and bold proclamations, gave a rare and simple nod, his face softened by pride. And Mom, Barron's voice caught slightly as he turned back to Melania. You've always been my anchor. When the world felt too loud or too overwhelming, you were there, protecting me, reminding me that I was more than just a name. I know I don't say it enough, but I love you. And I'm proud to be your son. A few audible sighs echoed through the room as Melania, wiping away a tear, smiled tenderly at her son. In that moment, the elegance and formality of the evening gave way to something far more powerful, a mother's love returned tenfold by her child. Barron took a breath, steadying himself as he continued. I'm 19 now. I know that means I have to start figuring things out for myself. And while I'm not sure exactly where life will take me, I do know this, I want to make a difference. His voice grew firmer, more confident. I want to be someone who brings people together, not divides them. I want to be someone who uses the platform I've been given to help others. And I hope someday that people will see me for who I really am, not just the family I come from. The room, already emotionally charged, erupted into applause. Even the most seasoned political figures accustomed to grand speeches were moved by the simplicity and truth in Barron's words. As the applause swelled, Barron leaned slightly toward the microphone with a playful smile. Also, I promise to stay out of the White House kitchen from now on. No more fire alarms. The laughter that followed was warm and genuine, breaking the emotional tension in the most perfect way. Before stepping away from the podium, Barron took one final glance at his parents. Thank you, he said simply. For everything. And thank you all for being here tonight, it means more than you know. He returned to his seat to a standing ovation, one that wasn't for Donald Trump's legacy or Melania's elegance, but for a young man who had, for the first time, shared his own voice. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone in the room. Barron Trump was ready to step out of the shadows and into his own light. As the applause echoed through the ballroom, Barron Trump returned to his seat, his usually composed face touched with a rare mixture of relief and warmth. For a young man known more for his silence than his words, he had just shared a piece of himself, unfiltered and real. And in a room filled with some of the most powerful people in America, his honesty had struck a chord. Donald Trump, seated beside Melania, leaned toward his son and clapped a large hand on his shoulder. Good job, kid, he said, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. But there was a softness in his tone, a pride that he rarely displayed in public. For all his political triumphs and towering presence, there was something about seeing his youngest son come into his own that even he couldn't ignore. The evening could have easily ended on that emotional high, but Donald Trump, never one to be outdone, slowly stood from his seat. The room shifted in anticipation. Whether you loved him or loathed him, when Donald Trump spoke, people listened. Adjusting the cuff of his navy suit, he made his way to the podium. Unlike Melania's carefully prepared remarks or Barron's heartfelt words, there was no speech in hand, just Donald Trump speaking straight from the gut. Well, he began, his familiar bravado echoing across the room. I didn't plan on giving a speech tonight. But after what my amazing wife and my incredible son just said, how could I not? Laughter rippled through the crowd. It was classic Trump, off the cuff, confident, and completely himself. I'll be honest, he continued, his tone light, when Barron was born, people told me a lot of things. He's going to be tall, they said. Well, they got that right, look at him. He gestured toward his towering son, prompting another round of chuckles. I mean, seriously, I'm a big guy, folks, but I look short next to him. Can you believe it? Even Barron, often composed in public, let out a quiet laugh, his father's larger-than-life personality somehow easing the tension. But here's what nobody told me, Trump went on, his voice softening just a little. Nobody told me how much I would learn from him. Nobody told me how proud I would be, not because of his height, not because of his last name, but because of the kind of man he's becoming. The audience grew quiet again, sensing a rare moment of genuine emotion from the former president. Now, you all know I've been in the spotlight a long time, he said, leaning slightly on the podium. I've had my share of critics. A few friends too, some of you in this room. A sly smile tugged at his lips as a few guests laughed knowingly. But through it all, no matter how tough it got, I always knew I had my family. His gaze shifted toward Melania. Melania, you've been the rock. Beautiful, strong, and so much smarter than people realize. The room applauded as Melania smiled graciously, but Trump wasn't finished. And Barron, you, my boy, are a gift. The words hung in the air, simple but profound. I've been tough on you sometimes, Trump admitted, his voice lower now. And maybe I didn't always say it the way a father should. But here's what I want you to know, you are everything a father could hope for. You've got brains, you've got heart, and let's be honest, you've got great genes. The playful remark earned another round of laughter, but the sentiment underneath was clear. The former president's voice softened even more as he shared a more private reflection. I remember the first time I held you in my arms, he said, his eyes distant as he recalled the memory. You were this tiny, perfect baby, didn't cry, just looked around like you already had things figured out. And I remember thinking, this boy is going to do great things. A hush fell over the ballroom. Whatever the world might say about Donald Trump, no one could deny the sincerity of his words in that moment. And you will, Trump declared firmly. You're going to write your own story, Barron. Not my story. Not your mother's. Yours. And whatever you choose to do, whether it's business, politics, or something else, I know you'll do it your way. And you'll do it well. A flicker of emotion passed across Barron's face. For a father known for his dominance and a son known for his quiet demeanor, there was a profound beauty in the exchange, a recognition between two men connected by blood but carving out separate legacies. Trump, sensing the emotional weight in the room, shifted gears again. Now, I know people are probably wondering, he said with a smirk, is Barron going to follow in his father's footsteps? Is he going to run for president one day? Laughter erupted as Barron shook his head slightly, clearly embarrassed. I don't know, folks. He's smart enough, maybe smarter than me. But I'll tell you one thing, whatever he decides to do, he's going to be amazing. He took a step back from the microphone, but then, almost as an afterthought, he leaned back in. And by the way, he added, flashing a grin, if he does run someday, he's got my vote. The ballroom erupted into applause and laughter, the light-hearted quip breaking the emotional intensity. But beneath the humor, everyone could see it, Donald Trump wasn't just speaking as a public figure. He was speaking as a proud father. As he returned to his seat, Trump reached out and shook his son's hand, a rare and public gesture of affection between them. Barron, still touched by the words, met his father's gaze with a quiet but unmistakable gratitude. The night had begun as a celebration of Barron's 19th birthday, but it had evolved into something far greater, a celebration of family, legacy, and the quiet power of a young man stepping into his own. And as the applause faded and the evening continued, one truth lingered in the hearts of everyone present. In a family known for its boldness, it was the quiet strength of a young man that had touched them all. As the evening moved on, the grand ballroom of Trump Tower buzzed with energy. Conversations swirled around Barron Trump's speech and the heartfelt words from both Melania and Donald Trump. But amidst the glittering lights and the sea of well-dressed guests, Barron sat quietly for a moment, taking it all in. He had never sought the spotlight. From the time he was a child, the world had watched him grow up, each public appearance analyzed, each gesture dissected. But tonight, something had shifted. For the first time, he had spoken for himself, and the world had listened. As the dinner service concluded, a soft melody from the string quartet filled the room. Guests mingled, sharing warm stories and light laughter, but Barron's mind lingered on his father's final words. You're going to write your own story, Barron. Those words echoed in his heart. For so long, the world had defined him by his father's legacy, a legacy of power, business, and controversy. But tonight, Barron felt a spark deep inside, the desire to create his own path. He wasn't sure exactly where life would take him, but he knew one thing: he wanted to make a difference. As the music shifted to a soft jazz tune, Ivanka Trump, Barron's half-sister, made her way across the ballroom toward him. Always poised and elegant, she wore a simple but striking silver gown that shimmered under the lights. Despite the 23-year age gap between them, Ivanka had always shared a unique bond with her youngest brother, part mentor, part confidant. "Hey, birthday boy," she teased gently, her warm smile easing the tension in his chest. "I have to say, I'm impressed. You've grown into quite the speaker." Barron chuckled softly, still adjusting to the attention. "I wasn't sure if I'd get through it," he admitted. "I've never really been good at this stuff." Ivanka shook her head. "You were more than good. You were honest. And that's something people don't forget." She paused for a moment, her expression softening. "I know it hasn't always been easy, being the Trump kid in the public eye. But you've handled it with grace. And tonight, you showed everyone who you really are." Her words settled over him like a warm blanket. For years, Barron had wrestled with the weight of expectations, always the quiet observer in a family full of bold personalities. But tonight, it felt like he had finally stepped forward, not just as his father's son, but as his own man. "Thanks, Ivanka," he said quietly. "That means a lot." She gave his shoulder a soft squeeze. "Anytime," she said warmly. "And for the record, if you ever do decide to run for something, you've got my vote too." They both laughed, the shared moment easing the pressure of the evening. But as Ivanka returned to mingle with other guests, Barron's thoughts turned inward. For the first time, the idea of public service didn't feel so far-fetched. Later in the evening, as the birthday cake, a towering masterpiece of chocolate and gold, was rolled out, Melania took her place beside Barron. Despite the whirlwind of speeches and tributes, she had been watching him closely all night, her heart full of pride. "You did well tonight," she said softly, her Slovenian accent still rich and warm after all these years. Barron smiled at his mother, the woman who had always been his fiercest protector and most loyal supporter. "I had a good teacher," he replied sincerely. Her eyes glistened with emotion as she brushed a lock of hair from his forehead, a gesture she had done since he was a little boy. "No matter where life takes you," she said quietly, "never forget who you are. And always follow your heart." He nodded, her words sinking deep into his soul. No cameras, no headlines, just a mother's love for her son, as timeless and powerful as ever. As the evening began to wind down, Barron slipped away from the main ballroom and stepped onto a private balcony overlooking New York City. The city lights stretched endlessly before him, glittering like a sea of possibilities. He leaned against the marble railing, breathing in the crisp March air. Behind him was a world of privilege, expectation, and family legacy, but ahead of him? That was still his to define. In the silence, his father's voice echoed once more. "You're going to write your own story." And for the first time, Barron believed it. He didn't know if he wanted to follow his father into politics. Maybe he'd forge a different path, one rooted in service, innovation, or something entirely new. But whatever it was, it would be his choice. As he stood there, a quiet determination grew in his heart. He had spent his life being known as Barron Trump, the son of Donald Trump. But starting tonight, the world would begin to know him as just Barron. And his story, his legacy, was only beginning.